Hello, listeners. Been wondering how you can help the show? Probably not. But here are 5 things you can do. 1. Subscribe. Support the show by clicking the subscription link in the show notes. 2. Review on iTunes, on our website, www.afraidofnothingpodcast.com, or on whatever app you listen to. 3. Donate. When you go to our website, click the cute coffee cup icon. Or in the show notes, click the subscription link. 4. Share. Sharing really is caring. Tell your friends and even your enemies to check out the show. 5. Watch. Wait a minute, it's a podcast, not a movie. Actually, it's both. Check the show notes to find out where to watch the documentary. You can also rent it on Prime Video. That's it. Oh, one last thing. Enjoy this episode.
You ever out in the woods and the wind smells really foul and you see all these tree limbs broken in half and before you know it, these big stones are pelting you from out of nowhere. And then you hear these guttural groans and by goodness, you're having a Bigfoot experience. Well, this is the show for you. Tonight, we talk cryptids and Bigfoot.
Bigfoot Sound Effect by Zapflat.com.
In a world where nothing is known, nothing is certain, reality is not real. Wake up! Be afraid of nothing. I'm Bob Heskey.
Robert.
The host with the ghost.
This is my podcast, based on my paranormal documentary, Afraid of Nothing. Each episode, we talk to people who see life and the afterlife through a different lens. Join me.
Who is this large man? And what's he doing in our bedroom?
As we lift the veil and open our minds to see beyond our eyes lie. This is Afraid of Nothing.
Aleksandar Petakov was born in 1993 during the last year of apartheid in South Africa to parents that fled civil war in former Yugoslavia. He grew up in the United States and has always been interested in global events, history, outdoors, and adventuring. A documentary filmmaker, one of his passions is cryptozoology, the subject of many of his short and feature-length films. He currently lives in New England, and in this show shares the sweet spots for cryptid folklore and sightings. We are here with my first program on cryptids, and one of the best guests I could probably get, Aleksandar Petakov. Alec, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, Robert, thanks for having me on.
You're an outdoors guy, and you also love cryptids. They both go together, but which came first, your love of the outdoors or your fascination with cryptozoology?
Oh, man, that's a really good question. That's a tough one, too, because like you said, they do definitely go hand in hand, especially Sasquatch or Bigfoot. If you're in some of the wilder areas of North America, as I've found myself on more than a few occasions, you can't help but wonder. I always loved nature. I mean, even when I was in elementary school and before that, I used to hide in recess and hide outside in the woods, and they'd call me Nature Boy. So I don't know. That's get like a chicken or the egg question. I'm going to say they probably came up at the same time because ever since I could remember, I was fascinated by the story of the Yeti, and that kind of got me into all the other cryptids and started watching documentaries on it, and then reading as much as I could growing up on the topic and just continuing that passion onto adulthood as well.
Was there a movie that you saw, like The Legend of Boggy Creek, or was there a movie you saw about Bigfoot that got you into it, or was it just reading something in the library as a kid?
A lot of people do get into it because of, The Legend of Boggy Creek, for example, or they saw the Patterson-Gimlin film in a drive-in theater. This was way back in the day before my time. But actually how I really got into it was, I remember I was pretty young. I was on a family ski trip in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and my dad told me the story of the Yeti. He gave me this figurine shadow box. It was really high quality. They just don't make toys like that anymore. Solid Yeti toy. And it came with this little scroll, little paper, like ancient looking scroll that had the story of the Yeti in the Himalayas. And there's something about that setting, being in the mountains and being told this story. From that point on, I knew I was really interested. So from then, that's kind of when the passion started. And like I said, I was really young when this was going on.
For our listeners that don't know, how would you define a cryptid? Is it like something unknown that lurks in the woods, or do you have a certain definition that you use?
Yeah, it's actually interesting. Cryptid is now a word in the dictionary. I think Merriam-Webster back in 2018, I believe, recognized that it's actually a word in the English language. So cryptid is a derivative of cryptozoology. You know, cryptozoology is basically the search for hidden or undiscovered animals. That's as it's been defined by greater men before me and greater men and women that were involved in this field. And cryptid would be one of these creatures, because you take cryptic, which is sort of mysterious, right?
Yeah.
And then combine that with zoology. So that's where you have cryptozoology. And basically there's lots of different creatures that might fit into that category. You have, I guess, somewhat of a spectrum. On one hand, something like Bigfoot, something which is a mythical creature basically said to exist in various parts of the world, whether it's the Yeti or the abominable snowman, the Yeren in China, the Almasties of Russia and the Caucasus, into Siberia, Bigfoot, Sasquatch. There's hundreds of names for something like hairy hominid creatures reported across the world. That would be somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. On the other end, you have something like the thylacine, which is the Tasmanian tiger, which is a marsupial kind of dog-like creature that's striped that is thought to be extinct. And the last known evidence was one in captivity that died almost 100 years ago. But there are still sightings that go on in mainland Australia and Tasmania to this day. So you're almost looking for an extinct animal. The coelacanth, which was a prehistoric fish thought to be extinct for 60 million years, was actually rediscovered in the 1930s after basically dropping off the fossil record for 60 million years. So that would fit on one end of the spectrum. And on the far other end, so you have coelacanths, mountain lions in the eastern part of the United States. You have the thylacine on one side of the spectrum. Towards the middle, I'd put something like Bigfoot and maybe some lake monsters, the Loch Ness Monster, that sort of thing. On the other end, you have stuff like Mothman, which is less sort of a creature, more paranormal involved in it. Now, a lot of people in cryptozoology wouldn't necessarily consider that a cryptid, because they'd say that we're talking strictly biological beings, things that are flesh and blood, whereas something like Mothman or some of these other stories tend to have a little bit more of a spiritual paranormal element to it. You know, there's UFOs involved, there's Men in Black. It kind of bridges the gap between the physical and the metaphysical, if you will. So that's sort of if I had to put it on a spectrum. Now, there's obviously lots of wiggle room in between, and various creatures like chupacabra and things that are reported around the world, some which are more believable than others, I would say. There's some that I could totally believe exist, others that I think are a little far-fetched. So it's definitely an interesting pursuit, I suppose, primarily because most of the people involved in cryptozoology are, I don't want to say pseudoscientific, but it's basically citizen scientists for the most part. You have some individuals that are from academia or coming from various professional backgrounds, but most people involved in this do not have a traditional sort of biological degree as a background. So it's a little bit more citizen scientist going on with the search for various cryptids.
It's a new frontier. It's kind of a mixture of zoology and folklore.
Definitely.
Look, we had the pandemic, as everybody knows, this past year. You were in New Hampshire. I was in Massachusetts. Were you kind of restricted to explore in New Hampshire, which there's still a lot of great places, or were you able to go to other places as well the past year?
Yeah, I mean, I actually had the good fortune of traveling quite a bit. Towards the beginning, I was in New Hampshire. All in all, you know, obviously it was a terrible thing what happened, and so many people's lives were ruined from various effects of what was going on. But you know, that didn't have to commute to work anymore. I was kind of having a little bit more free time. So I spent a lot of time. I spent almost every day after working at home going out into the woods and hiking around in a spot near me where there's been Bigfoot activity. And I had some strange things happen, hearing noises and almost like you're being followed at times in the woods, just kind of being out there alone, you know, finding evidence of moose and other critters. I had a face-to-face with a female moose, I think, the day Massachusetts declared lockdowns. So it was right around that time period. And it's actually going to be in an upcoming documentary I have called Beyond the Trail, the Granite State Bigfoot case, which is about this case. So I spent quite amount of time in the woods in New Hampshire, mostly in my area in southwestern New Hampshire. It was really nice, you know, just kind of reconnecting with nature in a way that usually you're out on the weekends or sometimes on weeknights if I get lucky. But here it was like literally every day for a couple months I was out there, and I really got to know this area pretty intimately. But aside from that, I did get to travel a bit. I filmed a production with a crew that I work with called Small Town Monsters. out in New York State. We were up in the Adirondack wilderness filming an upcoming documentary called On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Journey.
Wow.
Which is about Bigfoot researchers and sightings in the Adirondacks of upstate New York. I was also in Arizona looking for the Mogollon monster, which is a Bigfoot-like creature reported in the Mogollon Rim region. That was part of Chasing Legends, another production I worked on. With that same production, we then went to Lake Champlain in Vermont, and this past October, Louisiana, in South Louisiana in the bayous, looking for the elusive rougarou of Cajun folklore, which is sort of a werewolf-like creature.
This is a good segue, actually. I was going to start with New England. We'll go back to that. But let's start with that. Let's start with Chasing Legends, which is that series, which you're an executive producer on. And I don't know if you're also a cinematographer as well on some of these, but season 1, it's on your website. It captures 4 different kind of regional cryptids. You mentioned the rougarou, the pukwudgie, champ, which is kind of like our version of Loch Ness Monster in Vermont, and the Mogollon Monster. Can you talk very briefly about each of those 4 cryptids, and which of those 4 episodes did you think you got the best evidence that something is out there?
Funny thing about that series, is a friend of mine that's kind of his series, and asked me to come on as a guest investigator and being an executive producer. We filmed a week before lockdowns began across the country in Massachusetts in the Bridgewater Triangle in early March of 2020. The crew came out from Minnesota, where they were based out of, and that was the last time I remember being in downtown Boston, sense of normalcy, I guess. We filmed that first episode looking for the pukwudgie, and then obviously, when COVID hit, production got delayed quite a bit, so we didn't get out to Arizona until the summer, and then the rest of the episodes we filmed in the fall. Each episode takes place in a very different location. You have the Freetown State Forest in Massachusetts, one of these supposedly most haunted forests in America, where there's been a lot of really dark activity from humans, mob killings, satanic rituals involving murders, and all kinds of criminal activity in that area. It has a very dark omen. And of course, it's part of this Bridgewater Triangle lore, including the pukwudgies, which is primarily what we're there for. So you have kind of a winter forest setting, whereas Arizona, Mogollon Rim, is thick pine forests, mountains of Arizona, where you have mountain lions and black bear and all sorts of threats around you, animals that might try to kill you for just being there, as opposed to, the Mogollon monster, which is reported to be a Bigfoot-like creature. So that's not the only threat really there. Then you have Lake Champlain, this massive lake in Vermont and New York, 120 miles long, almost 400 feet deep at its deepest area, where you have this report of Lake Champlain, kind of America's version of Loch Ness. And finally, the last setting is South Louisiana, which might even be more dangerous than the Mogollon Rim in Arizona and the bayous, where you don't have much land, actually. It's all bayou and swampland, and you have alligators and water moccasins, which are extremely poisonous, and all sorts of spiders and critters that want to kill you as well. So the 4 settings couldn't be more different, and the creatures all were very different as well. You had much more maybe on the flesh and blood side with something like Champ or Bigfoot, and then more metaphysical and folkloric with the pukwudgies and the rougarou of the Cajun folklore, which was much more connected with spiritualism and even some religious overtones, Cajun Catholicism and some Christian overtones and Creole folklore, a mixture of things. So it was definitely very interesting to do those 4 different cryptids in very different locations.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hi there. Do you love stories that start out ordinary, but with the turn of a universe become unforgettable, life-changing moments? So do I. I'm Ruru Sig, and I'm inviting you to the Story Chaser podcast. Join the adventure, and I promise that you will laugh, cry, and feel inspired when you listen to my narrative essays. Click the link in the notes and listen to the Story Chaser podcast, where great stories are told well.
So which of those, look, I when I made a documentary, I went to a couple of haunted houses. Luckily, I did get some stuff, but it is hard to get stuff, when you go for a couple of days or even if you're there for a week. So part of it is probably who you interview and the people that you meet out there. Which of these 4 episodes, which of these 4 creatures, which of these 4 cryptids did you walk away feeling was most likely to exist?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, all of them, you come out, any of these kinds of experiences, and, these are not the only cryptid investigations I've done. I've done lots of other ones. Each of them, you come out of it with sort of an appreciation. Now, the pukwudgie came out a little bit skeptical, mostly a story, but that area has just such a dark history, whether it's back to King Philip's War with the colonists and the heinous crimes that took place then, both warring sides, absolute slaughtering of each other. That land carries a heavy sort of burden. And then all the stuff that's happened subsequently. I mean, just some of the really disgusting things that have taken place in the Freetown area. It's almost like the Pukwudgie story is the least of your concern when you're out in that area.
Yeah, it's like a Pandora's box out there with, even zombies.
Oh yeah.
UFOs, zombies,
UFOs,
whatever.
I mean,
is
the Hockomock with the Bigfoot stuff. But the Freetown forest in particular, I mean, just being connected with so much criminality and just scary kind of things that come more from a human threat level. But I'd say probably the two I came out of the most appreciating or the most evidence of are the Mogollon Monster and Champ. What I will say, though, before I talk about those, that with the Rougarou, I don't think it's a physical sort of being, but me going to the place like that or our crew or whoever, when you go to a place like this, you're basically talking to people who have grew up in these hospitable areas. I mean, the ancestors of the Cajuns settled in land after they were ethnically cleansed from the English areas of Canada, Nova Scotia, the Acadians. That's who they were. They were kicked out of this harsh, cold climate they'd been living in for a couple centuries, and then were put in another inhospitable land with everything trying to kill you, as I mentioned, the bayous. So we go down there and they tell us this story. And, we talk to people who were very sincere about what they'd seen or what their ancestors had told them about this Rougarou. And who am I to go there and say, well, I don't think this is real? Like I said, I don't think it's necessarily a physical, undiscovered species of upright canine, but I think that there maybe are some stranger things that we might not understand in terms of what is reality going on with a story like the Rougarou. But when it comes to the Mogollon Monster, what was really interesting was when conducting a night investigation out there, we had split up our team. Most of the crew was walking around with some forward-looking infrared FLIR units, basically scanning the forest, and myself and one of the camera guys were just hanging out by the fire. And a lot of Bigfoot research, the idea is you create a curiosity, bring something in. So we had seen a herd of elk on that night when we were doing our night investigation. And as the other crew was making their way up a hill, we could see them in the distance, the other team, I should say. Myself and the cameraman heard what could only be described as a wood knock or some kind of a rock smashing against a tree, which is something commonly reported with Bigfoot activity. It's actually a behavior in chimpanzees. They'll communicate back and forth using wood knocks as sort of a communicative method, I suppose, when there's one in, let's say, a valley or one on the hill. That's how they communicate. And that's something that's been reported with Bigfoot for centuries. And I've experienced that in other locations. But we heard one clear wood knock. And what was really interesting to me was the reaction of the camera guy, who wasn't really into this kind of stuff. Yet he immediately was like, wow, that was really loud. And I don't know what that could have been. So we came out of that with renewed interest in the Mogollon case. I mean, it was just interesting talking to people there who claim to have had experiences, but that's an area I definitely would like to go back and check out. But I think it's much more in line with Bigfoot that's reported in other areas as well. It's just a regional sort of version. And when it came to Champ is something that's one of my favorite cryptids. I've looked into the Champ case quite a bit. I did a documentary series on it called On the Trail of Champ for Small Town Monsters back in 2018. While we didn't have so much happen when we were at Lake Champlain, we talked to so many witnesses. And when you're up there, it's almost as if you just run into people who have had an experience or know people who have an experience. And you're talking communities that are hours apart between the New York side of the lake and towards the Canadian border. I mean, it's just such a massive community, but people all across that lake know people who have seen strange things, and people who are credible, who have lived there their entire lives, reporting they're seeing something with a dinosaur-like head. So that trip, some of them we just stumbled into people that happen to have stories. Other ones were folks that had sightings as recently as a couple months before we were there, near the location of the Mansi photo from 1977. So for me, it was just interesting to go back to that location that I'd been and have spent such a bunch of time at before and see, well, it's still going on. It seems like 2020, there was a lot more sightings because with the lockdowns and everything going on, the commerce between Canada and the US, which part of the lake is in Canada. So there weren't as many large boats coming through. So the water clarity this year was very clear. You didn't have any big commerce boats coming through. And there's probably more people in the water simply because, people aren't traveling around the rest of the country or in other parts of the world as much. So all summer long, more people were on the boat. Yeah. Or you had some people traveling to Lake Champlain, maybe from the surrounding areas. So there was more scrutiny maybe on the water, but there definitely seemed to be an uptick in sighting. So yeah, it was really interesting. Those are kind of the conclusions I drew. For Champ, it was just sort of a confirmation of what I had already known, just gaining more knowledge on the topic. And then Mogollon Monster and the rest of them definitely gained some insight.
Yeah, I got to tell you, the Pukwudgie I know is kind of skeptical. I don't know if I did an episode. I interviewed the guy who bought the Hinsdale house, Daniel Klaus, and that house is in upper state New York, very haunted. But the grounds, like a lot of places, like the Conjuring house too, like the grounds, are medium step on the ground and like, oh my God, there's this activity from the Indians and fighting with the settlers. But yeah, up in Hinsdale, New York, they've had stuff up in the woods too, where I thought he said someone had a picture where they thought they got a Pukwudgie in a tree. There was some little type of figure in a tree watching them or something. So they almost seem to be like protectors of an Indian land or a reservation, or where there's some curse. They're almost kind of protectors or guardians or something of that area.
Yeah.
But who knows? But yeah, the one time I heard about it was when I interviewed the guy from the Hinsdale house, and he said, "Oh yeah, we had someone that caught something." I'm like, wow, that's crazy.
Definitely interesting. I mean, it's one of those stories that's told by Wampanoags, and it's in a lot of other Algonquin speaking tribes in this sort of New England area. So, I mean, who am I to say that their stories aren't valid? Again, it's not one of those things that I think it's necessarily maybe an undiscovered species of something. It's much more maybe blends or blurs the line between reality and paranormal.
Yeah. Let's go back to New England. Let's go around. If you were going around New England, let's start New Hampshire. What's the one or two best places in New Hampshire to go if you're interested in cryptozoology or want to run into something, and hopefully you're not going to die from it?
Sure. I mean, New Hampshire, it's not really well known for its cryptid stuff. It's a little bit more well known for the UFO activity and a lot of the hauntings and the ghost haunted cemeteries, that sort of stuff. But it's the second most forested state in the United States after Maine, which is neighboring Maine, which we're the only state that actually borders Maine. And much of that border is forested, especially in the northern part. So New Hampshire is a perfect place for Sasquatch, like much of the Northeast, and whether it's in the Adirondack region, upstate Vermont, into New Hampshire, and then Maine. I mean, you have, I think, upwards of 80% of New Hampshire is forested. So there's a lot of areas. I mean, particularly the northern part of the state where the White Mountain National Forest is, and the counties there, especially Coos County, known as the Great North Woods region. That's where there's a story called the Wood Devil, which are told by old timers. I believe it's a logging story. It's reported to be this tall, hairy creature that's hides behind trees so well that you could almost walk into one before you see it. And they kind of blend in, and they let out these piercing screams at night, and are basically used as stories to frighten kids. I mean, I'd heard of the story, and I've been trying to track down the origins for quite a while. And it's told up in that area in Coos County a little bit here and there. And I've actually been told by people that said, well, my family's originally from there. I grew up going there every summer. And, my grandfather used to scare us with the story of don't go too far in the woods or the wood devils will get you. And something you find across North America with Sasquatch are local stories, whether it's the skunk ape of Florida or the Ohio grassman, the Mogollon monster, as I mentioned, Bigfoot, which was originally just sort of a Northern California name because you had Sasquatch, which was up in Canada. And now those terms have kind of become ubiquitous for the entire phenomena, but you have lots of other regional names.
I was going to ask, are there like big cats too in New Hampshire, like the mysterious cats that you thought were extinct?
Oh, absolutely.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to get to that for sure. So Bigfoot is probably the biggest one for New Hampshire, I'd say, in terms of cryptids, because basically anywhere you go in a lot of these areas, chances are there's reported sightings. And I know that there's up to 250 plus sightings with the BFRO, Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. I've got about 2 to 3 dozen reports that have never been online or told. People have just told me kind of from varying parts of the state, from the Monadnock region, Coos County, the White Mountains, southern New Hampshire, basically all the counties. I mean, all over the place. So that's definitely the biggest cryptid in New Hampshire. Secondly would be, I'd say, mountain lions, just because it's one of those things that they just pop up everywhere, yeah. The sightings and the stories, and they're a lot more mainstream than Bigfoot as a topic, because, people can believe mountain lions exist because they are a living, breathing species that we have documented, and they used to live in this part of the country. And a project that I actually released right around the time COVID came out called Lions of the East is all about mountain lion sightings specifically in New England. I basically traveled to Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, covered a little bit of Connecticut and Rhode Island as well. And the stories and researchers, I had people reaching out to me, biologists and people who have had their livestock and horses attacked by supposed mountain lions that have come out with DNA evidence confirming that was actually the case, and a little bit of a conspiracy with the states that don't want to recognize some of that stuff. And present all across New England, but New Hampshire is no exception. One of the stories in particular was a biologist who reached out to me There's always this sort of every couple of years in New Hampshire, there's a surge in mountain lion interest. So people get interested in the stories, and then the amateur researchers and the people that are involved in the tale sort of emerge. And I got interviewed for one of these pieces, and a biologist reached out to me and said, hey, I had a experience in 2001, I believe, where I found scat on a mountain up in the Ospey Mountains in New Hampshire. Turned out to DNA tests come back as mountain lion DNA. And the whole conspiracy kind of with the state of New Hampshire with that particular case. So mountain lions are definitely in New Hampshire, whether they're just passing through, as even some of the fish and game people will tell you. You have the western populations that are expanding eastward. One of the cases that got me interested in doing this topic was back 2011 when I was in college. I heard a story about a mountain lion that was struck by a car and killed in Connecticut. It was a confirmed case. They did DNA testing on it about an hour from New York City, and came back as his genetic makeup was from the Black Hills of South Dakota. So it traveled all the way from South Dakota to Connecticut, believe it or not. And I actually had the coincidental chance of meeting a off-duty police officer from Connecticut at a paranormal event in New Hampshire who told me he had seen that very mountain lion a few days before it had been killed. Wow. About 4 or 5 miles from where that happened. Immediately, he told the rest of the guys on the crew, on the force, and everyone kind of thought, well, it was probably a bobcat. He's like, I know what I saw. I mean, clearly a mountain lion. Lo and behold, not that far away, a few days later, this thing gets struck by a car and killed on a highway. Very populated, one of the most populated areas of New England. And this thing was hiding out there for who knows how long. So you can only imagine in the sparsely populated parts of upstate New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, these creatures essentially would be the top of the food chain. You've got moose and deer plentiful, so they'd be able to move through these areas and maybe be seen, maybe not be seen. And there's plenty of sightings to speak to that going back to 1930s and beyond.
Where are they supposed to be? Where are mountain lions supposed to be in the country? The middle part, or where? Why is it weird for them to be out in the Northeast?
I mean, essentially they were extirpated, which is basically means they're extinct. They're supposed to be extinct in the eastern part of the United States, going back to when these areas were logged out and a lot of the big predators and much of the wildlife was pushed out when a lot of this forest land became agricultural land, and they were seen as a nuisance for sheep and livestock and cattle. So they were just basically hunted to extinction in this area, supposedly. Some people believe maybe some populations survived in parts of Canada and New Brunswick or Quebec and made their way down. But their general accepted range is kind of the Rocky Mountains westward. So once you get past the Rocky Mountains and up into California and Canada, that's areas where people deal with mountain lions a lot. I mean, there's huge documented populations. I mean, even when I was out in April, I was in Washington State. We were in the Olympic National Forest. We had a mountain lion track that we found right on a trail. I mean, a juvenile mountain lion. But those are areas where people deal with mountain lions all the time. But there's also some populations of the Dakotas, and there's evidence that they're moving eastward to the Midwest. There's a lot of sightings, and there's some confirmed sightings, and there's really nothing stopping them from moving further eastward. And it's usually these lone males, basically, when they're old enough to go on their own, they try to make their way in the world and find a mate and start a family, and they just end up wandering. A lot of them just make it eastward and probably just die out here, not able to find a mate. But some people have said, well, maybe some populations survived that initial extinction, and there's a few females. It's a really interesting question, but all across the East Coast, not just New England, up and down, the only population you have that's confirmed actually is in Florida with the Florida panthers. And there's a few hundred, basically just a subspecies of the mountain lion that live in that part of Florida and in some of the forest land down there. That's the only recognized population on the eastern seaboard. So, a lot of these states just don't want to admit that they are maybe coming through. And there's been a little bit of a controversy with folks because of that topic. So it's an interesting topic. It definitely creates a lot of enthusiasm. People get very frustrated one way or another, saying, oh, they're definitely not here. They definitely are here. And that's kind of why I decided to dive into that topic. And I found it pretty interesting because people always told me about their sightings.
What was the name of that documentary and where can you watch it?
Called Lions of the East. And right now, the only place you can check it out is on my website through a digital copy.
Yep. Okay, cool.
And you get the link and you get to watch it on there. I'm going to have more DVDs made at some point when events start back up again. But yeah, it came out unfortunately right as COVID started, so I never even got to have the premiere or any of the subsequent screenings. I was supposed to do screenings all over New England, but obviously that didn't take place. So
yeah, the two times I had I made a film, and it was in the Boston Sci-Fi Film Festival, which is in February. Both times it was a blizzard.
Oh,
a very small crowd showed up. I had a drama that I made like in 15, 16, and played maybe a year later. A couple of years ago, my paranormal documentary got in, and it was on a paranormal kind of block of stuff. And yeah, it was just both nights. It was like, horrible weather. I'm like, oh my God, this is horrible.
Yeah, they don't pick a great time for that event. I've actually had a couple friends who did a documentary about UFO stuff up in Maine. And of course, I remember it was a couple of years ago. It was a big blizzard, so I didn't even get to make it out there, unfortunately. So yeah, I know how it is to have that ruined.
Yeah, well, you're an outdoor guy. You deal with tough weather all the time. The rest of us are a little more wimpy. So New Hampshire, all right. What about Maine? Where in Maine would you go? Where do you think are some good places in Maine?
Oh man, Maine has more coastline than New Hampshire, so there's some great sea serpent history with the Casco Bay serpent, as it's called, and a place you can visit in Portland, which I would highly recommend, is the International Cryptozoology Museum, which is the only one of its kind, run by a friend of mine, Lauren Coleman, who is one of the world's foremost cryptozoologists. I mean, he's written so many books and been in so many documentaries and has been investigating this topic much longer than I've been alive. And he has this awesome museum, which if you're into this kind of stuff, you'll love it up there.
Did he coin the phrase the Bridgewater Triangle? Was that him?
Yes.
Okay.
He coined the phrase both Bridgewater Triangle and Dover Demon.
All right. Wow.
So he's been around for quite a while, and he's a legend. I'm actually heading up to the museum at the end of this month, May, to interview him and talk about the museum a little bit for another documentary about Bigfoot in Maine specifically. So that'll be a lot of fun. Definitely a great spot to go check out. And you can learn about cryptids from all over the world there and some of the Maine stuff. And it'll show you on a map. They have maps of supposed Bigfoot sightings and mountain lion sightings as well in Maine. Now, Maine, as I mentioned, is the most forested state in the United States. So the Great North Maine Woods is the least populated part of the entire eastern seaboard. I mean, basically east of the Rockies, it's the largest patch of uninhabited land where you have a larger population of moose and black bear than you do human beings. I mean, there's some areas where people just don't live. Absolutely wild. Now, most of the sightings of Bigfoot take place in the other parts of the state where there are people, because to have Bigfoot sightings, you need people, of course. I mean, you could have 300 Bigfoot or however many creatures in an area. If there's nobody up there, who's there to see them and to document them, right? So
yeah,
Bigfoot's a big one in Maine. You also have the stories of the spectral moose, which is kind of a tale in much of northern New England, the Great North Woods regions.
The spectral moose, like a ghost moose? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, almost like a very large moose that's seen much larger. I mean, you're talking upwards of 20 feet and very ghostly in appearance. And, the Native Americans had the story of the Pamula, which was described as a, moose that could fly. It was the guardian of Mount Katahdin, and lots of other stories in that area. What's interesting is you have albino moose. That's something that biologically can happen. So maybe in the past, people had seen something like an albino moose.
Yeah, wow.
It's created a story. Or you have, unfortunately, what's called the white moose, ghost moose, which has been decimating a lot of the moose populations in New England, is the deer tick problem. And in the winter tick, I should say, the ticks, they'll get thousands of ticks on them. And what'll happen is it'll be such an irritation that they'll start rubbing off their fur. Basically, all that will come off as they're, scratching, get thousands upon thousands of ticks off, and it exposes them to the elements. They lose their natural fur coat, basically. So they're more susceptible to hypothermia. So that was decimating moose populations in New Hampshire specifically. But it can give them almost like a white, chalky appearance too. So maybe people had seen that in the past. Maybe there really is a moose. I mean, there are certainly animals that can get humongous. So maybe there's been in the past, giant moose that was seen and created a bit of a legend. But, humans tend to exaggerate sometimes with eyewitness details. So it's possible that, maybe the moose that was actually 1,000 pounds turned out to be 3,000 pounds in the story and, was twice as big as it was in real life. But yeah, so Maine has a fair share of stories.
We should also mention the International Cryptozoology Museum, which you said in Portland. It's the only one of its kind, right? I don't think there's another museum like that for cryptozoology. It's like the museum, correct?
Yep. It's the only one that encompasses the topic of cryptozoology. Now, there are plenty of other museums that involve Bigfoot specifically, or the Loch Ness Monster, or there's, some places in Vermont that have like champ exhibits in their museums. You have some great places in Colorado. You have the Sasquatch Outpost. Cliff Barrickman of Finding Bigfoot has the North American Bigfoot Center out in Oregon. So those are, more cryptid specific, whereas the Cryptozoology Museum, you can learn about lake monsters and Bigfoot and mountain lions and dogman in the same kind of place. So it's definitely unique. It's one of a kind. And I definitely would recommend it to anybody in the New England area, especially if you're going up to Portland, you can make a trip out of it. Or if you're going camping up in Maine this summer, It's a great place to stop. It's right off the highway, and you can go and check it out. And they have some awesome, great stuff in the gift shop. And I know a bunch of the staff there too, and they're all really into this stuff, so they can tell you about anything you really want to know.
Oh, that's cool. And I think when you talk about Vermont, you're probably talking about Lake Champlain, right? Is that the number one place you'd go to?
Oh, yeah. For me, absolutely. I mean, Vermont has a rich history of Bigfoot sightings as well, especially around the Whitehall, New York area. Whitehall, New York is probably the best well-known place in the East Coast for Bigfoot. You have the famous A-Bear Road incident. And Whitehall is only a couple miles from the Vermont border. It's tucked right at the southern end of Lake Champlain, which is really interesting. Whitehall is where you had a lot of the historical champ sightings right outside of town in that part of South Lake Champlain. In the 1870s, you had the Serpent Scare, and the Whitehall Times used to write about the champ stuff going on. And now it's known for Bigfoot. So you go to Whitehall now, you can see Bigfoot statues and Champ's Restaurant all in the same sort of area. So it's kind of a cryptid melting pot area, which I think is sort of neat. But Lake Champlain, for sure, one of the most beautiful places in New England, in my opinion. You know, I say this as a mountain guy, but if I want to go to a beach, I go to Lake Champlain. Beautiful, beautiful area, and the stories and the history on both the Vermont and New York sides of the lake really speak to a lot of the cryptids. And there are other reports, you know, more obscure, maybe more folkloric creatures, and there's some awesome stories that have been done on that. And a friend of mine, Joe Citro, who's a fantastic author in Vermont, has a really cool, it almost is like a graphic novel kind of thing, very comic book style, called the Vermont Monster Guide, done with Stephen Bissett. Stephen Bissett, another friend of mine who was one of the original Swamp Thing comic artists. So they did a fantastic job talking about a lot of the weird creatures and stories in Vermont. And those guys know a little bit more about the mysteries of the Green Mountain State.
Yeah, that's the way to do it as a graphic novel if you're going to do something like on Cryptid. So that's a smart.
Yeah, definitely very, very cool. I mean, I don't get me wrong. I love the books. I mean, I have a book right in front of me right now that I've read, but I'm skimming through it again. Clocks in at about 500 plus pages, called Shadows in the Woods, a chronicle of Bigfoot in Maine by Daniel S. Green. And it's nothing but text, but if you're into this stuff as I am, it's a great read. I mean, this is, I'm reading it now as I'm preparing in a month or so to, you know, film Bigfoot expedition up in Maine. We're going to be heading up there filming for a documentary and really spending time in some of the more remote parts of the Great North Woods, basically looking for Bigfoot.
Oh, that's great. So let's go to Connecticut. I never hear much about Connecticut. Well, you have, of course, like the Conjuring Museum or whatever, the Annabelle Museum is there. But right. So I guess that's one place you should throw a plug at. But where in Connecticut would you go?
Yeah, so I went to school in Connecticut. I was kind of in the New Haven area. I'll be honest, I wasn't a huge fan of the state because I'm much more of a nature guy. And Connecticut has some beautiful nature, don't get me wrong, but it's, you know, nothing like in New Hampshire or even some parts of Massachusetts and Western Mass. But there are Bigfoot stories again in Connecticut, historically too. One of the most famous ones in New England, actually, called the Winstead Wild Man of 1895, where basically a man was blueberry picking with his bulldog, and they thought a black bear was, you know, in the field eating blueberries, and it stood on two legs and ran away like a man and was covered in hair. And it created one of those classic, iconic monster posses where, you know, a bunch of the townspeople were all armed and trying to find what they called the wild man. You'll find that a lot with the old newspaper reportings prior to the knowledge of gorillas and apes and the term Bigfoot. A lot of these strange stories were wild men, you know, 8-foot tall, hairy wild man seen outside of town, that sort of stuff. And that Winstead Wild Man was a famous case. And there are still some parts of Connecticut that have stories. Been to the northwestern part around the Appalachian Trail. There's definitely a couple stories of Bigfoot in that area. I've known a couple of researchers down there. And towards the Rhode Island border, actually, where you have some of the reservation lands out there. There's like the T area between southern Massachusetts and the northwest corner of Rhode Island. That's a lot of woods there. There's still some reports to this day, but not as many as other parts of New England, I'd say. But definitely a few stories. I mean, there's stories in Connecticut of all kinds of haunted places, as you mentioned. There's also stories of the melon heads, which I wouldn't really consider a cryptid, more of kind of misunderstanding with maybe people that have genetic deformities, and, you know, how in the past that wasn't really, people didn't understand that much.
Yeah.
Stuff like that was treated, was maybe unfortunate in modern standards, but, you know, people didn't really have a knowledge for it. So you maybe had societal outcasts that had strange deformities that were, you know, molded into this scary legend. I don't know.
I was going to say, because Connecticut is mostly known for like paranormal ghost activity and haunted houses and things like that. So there's a lot of stuff. The last two, Rhode Island, you touched on it a little bit. Anything in Rhode Island in particular? I mean, we know it has haunts, but anything in the wild?
Well, there's a couple interesting sea serpent reports, including the Block Ness Monster, which is a pretty funny name. Nessie and Loch Ness Monster being one of the most famous cryptid stories in the world, aside from Bigfoot. A lot of these, you'll see a lot of other lake monsters in the world will be named similar to the Loch Ness Monster. So sometimes Champ is referred to as America's Loch Ness, or you have the Block Ness Monster, which is basically this strange carcass that washed up in the late 90s near Block Island, Rhode Island. People kind of weren't sure what it was. It was serpent-like, this very unusual carcass, and it ended up getting stolen. Somebody basically stole the carcass, but they started to make souvenirs about it, and it was kind of the talk of the town for a whole summer. There's also another interesting, I believe the mid-2000s, an attack in like the early 2004 or 5, something like that. This couple was swimming at Teddy's Beach in Rhode Island. I'll have to double check, but they reported this strange creature that swam up to them and hissed at them, and they felt their lives were threatened, and nobody could really explain what it was. Description wise, some people said, well, maybe it was a strange tropical fish that ended up here, or some kind of a leopard seal from the Arctic. Some very outlandish explanations. So Rhode Island has a few sea serpent stories, and then aside from that, a couple mountain lion stories, and then Bigfoot as well in some of those parts of the state. There's a lot of woods, and maybe there's a Sasquatch passing through from parts of Massachusetts into Connecticut. As I mentioned, that T area where you have the intersections of the 3 states. That's an area where there's been some reports.
Okay. I live in central Massachusetts. I live right near Leominster, which I don't know if you know Ron LeBlanc, and his book Monsterland.
Yeah.
And then there's the Bridgewater Triangle, and then there's the Western Mass, as you mentioned. Which of those would you venture into and have? Well, I guess Bridgewater Triangle might be it because it was in your series Chasing Legends. But can you touch on the Bridgewater Triangle and anywhere else in Massachusetts?
Yeah. I've been all across Massachusetts, being in close proximity, of course. Massachusetts has sort of the most diverse range of cryptids in New England, I'd say, bar none, simply because you have the stories of the Bridgewater Triangle, then the Dover Demon, which was, an incident in the 1970s where these students saw this strange, spindly-looking creature that nobody could really explain. It's one of the most popular cryptids still to this day, despite the fact that there was only a rash of sightings that happened way back when. And that, as I mentioned earlier, that term was coined by Lauren Coleman, who's now up in Maine, but he was in Massachusetts at the time in Boston and was investigating that and the phenomenon in the Bridgewater Triangle. But in the Bridgewater Triangle itself, there's stories of thunderbirds, Bigfoot-like creatures, devil dogs with red eyes, large snake-like creatures, even an octopus supposedly in the Hockomock Swamp. Puckwudgies, as I mentioned, lots of winged humanoids. So there's like a weird, all kinds of stuff going on. The Bridgewater Triangle has ghosts and UFOs and everything else going on too. But just because of that area, there's so many different types of cryptids, I suppose. And whether or not, all of them are real, I don't know. But some of the Bigfoot sightings, especially that happened in the past when that area was even more forested, are very similar to other reports. Including one where a woman was having her property kind of disturbed, and the chickens, I don't know if they were being killed, but they were definitely being stolen. Police were kind of dispatched, hanging out at the end of the street. She lived, towards an area where there's a lot of woods and the Hockomock Swamp, which the Native Americans considered to be cursed and wouldn't go into. The cop basically said that the back of his cruiser was picked up and dropped, and he saw this hairy man-like creature leaving. And, there's other reports like that have taken place in other parts of the country. Other Sasquatch reports, and actually a documentary I did in, must have been 2017 at this point, about a Bigfoot hunter in the Bridgewater area called Joseph DeAndre. He was actually featured in that Bridgewater Triangle documentary by my buddy Aaron Cadieux. He had an experience near the Hockomock Swamp many years ago, and I interviewed him and kind of did a little piece on the Bridgewater Bigfoot stories. But yeah, there's a lot of stories in the Bridgewater Triangle. But then we get to something like Monsterland, which you were saying, Ronnie has talked about, and I've been to that area. Certainly there's a history of Bigfoot in that area.
I tried to interview him, but then it was one of the things he didn't have a good connection, and then he got busy with other stuff, so I couldn't get him again. But he had mentioned he saw I think it was him, that experience where he saw a Bigfoot and then it disappeared. And that's that whole Bigfoot thing where it's got that ET type of angle or transporting you into another realm type of thing. What's your thought about that? You don't buy into that? Or what's your thought about the ET aspect of Bigfoot, where there are UFO sightings typically where Bigfoot sightings are, and they can disappear despite how big they are and right in front of your eyes sometimes?
Yeah, I've heard that. I'm personally not necessarily subscribed to that. I've never had a Bigfoot sighting to say either way, but I've had strange things happen out in the woods. And been followed by something or something stalking nearby. I mean, I can't obviously say it's Bigfoot, but I've talked to a lot of people, maybe a couple hundred people at this point, who have claimed to have seen Bigfoot or had experiences. And a vast majority of them, they're describing something that's acting like a biological animal in the sense that it's just trying to get away or it's not exhibiting any strange behaviors. That being said, there are some people I've spoken to that said there were stranger elements, glowing orbs or strange lights involved with the sightings. And that doesn't necessarily fit with what I believe Bigfoot is, but I'm not going to disregard that just because I didn't have that experience. If they're credible enough, they have no reason to lie to me, or talking about Bigfoot as outlandish as it is, why would they add on these other stranger details? I would say those are a minority of reports that I get or that I've talked to people about, but they're still there. And just because they don't fit my paradigm, I'm not going to disregard them, even though I might not necessarily believe that's what's going on. But yeah, that's reported across the country in different areas. But as I mentioned, I think the vast majority of sightings are people simply having a roadside sighting where something crosses in front of the car. It's just unusual enough, not really any stranger elements. But there are certain areas where there seems to be weird stuff going on. In Monsterland, there's, I guess, a history of orbs being seen. But then out in Western Massachusetts, actually, where we have a lot of forest land. And good buddies of mine, Jonathan Wilk, who is the leader of Squatchachusetts, which is a Bigfoot research group in Mass. Really great guys and gals. I mean, just such a fantastic group. He's had a lot of stuff go on out in Western Massachusetts, an area where he used to be a park ranger, where he actually saw 2 Sasquatch in Savoy State Forest. There's been reports as of even recently in that area, howls and people getting rocks thrown at them and strange things going on in the woods. And there's a long history. North Adams, there's the monster of Coca-Cola Ledge, which is this Bigfoot-like creature. So they live in a cliff above town. And there's definitely a history of it in Massachusetts, even though people think of Mass that might not be from New England. They think it's all just Boston and urban and coastline. But once you get out to central and western Mass, and even the Bridgewater area, I mean, Freetown Forest and Hockomock, might not be as big as other areas, but there's still a good amount of woods and space where something could perhaps move through and live in for a short while before going to another area.
Yeah. You mentioned a little while ago your friend Aaron Cadu, who I don't know, but I've certainly watched his documentary a few times. I think it's really one of the better made documentaries by a smaller production company. Also, your buddy Seth Breedlove with Small Town Monsters does a great job. I love watching a lot of his stuff as well, that you've worked on some of those. But your friend made it was called the Bridgewater Triangle, which I thought was a really good documentary. I'm sure you've seen it too. What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's awesome. I've talked to Aaron a number of times. I've had him on my live stream show that I do on YouTube called Sasquatch Out of the Shadows, just talking about that. And, he's a filmmaker. He's not really into this stuff from the investigative side. He just sort of thought it was an interesting topic, grew up in the area and always heard the stories, whether it's the satanic stuff or UFOs or Bigfoot. I mean, there's just so much going on in one area story-wise. I mean, it's not like in the Pacific Northwest where just Bigfoot's everywhere. Bigfoot's like the most common thing there. It's literally everything on the list that you can think of. So that documentary is fantastic, and I would recommend it to folks because it simply is a look at everything going on. I mean, it talks about all those aspects, from the murders going on in the Freetown Forest to the Bigfoot stuff in the Hockomock. It doesn't really spend too much time on any one topic, but it does a great job of giving you an overview of that area and the history and going back to the Wampanoags and some of that history. And just a great primer if you're interested in the Bridgewater area. Like, that's one that I would definitely recommend. And also the narrator is a friend of mine, John Horgan. I've worked with him quite a bit. He's actually the narrator on Lions of the East, my documentary. He's a fantastic researcher. He got out of the whole cryptid and paranormal research when the internet came around. So he's always interesting to talk to because he's pre-internet era research. So, he'll relay stories that he knows from the 90s that he heard in Ohio or the Pacific Northwest and in his travels. So it's really interesting to kind of have that little bit of a balance.
Yeah, we should talk about some of your films too. You have quite a few pretty cool ones with Small Town Monsters. Have you finished it? Is it in post yet, On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Journey, or is that still being worked on?
That is, that's one that I'm in. I worked crew on that, and I'm also in the documentary as an investigator, along with Seth and some of the gang. That is actually, it premiered recently in Ohio, but it's coming out to general audiences in June on the streaming platforms and online and everything, and DVD. So you'll definitely want to tune into that, because that one, not only is it about the Adirondacks in upstate New York, but we have a little segment. We actually go out to Western Massachusetts and we're talking to the Squatchachusetts guys. We do interviews with them, and John tells his full story, and it shows upstate New York and the Adirondack region in a way that I don't think it has before in terms of Bigfoot. So that was a really fun journey. That was like the first post months of lockdown trip that we all took, even though it was not that far of a journey, but we spent time in the wilderness and met some great researchers, and everyone had kind of been cooped up for months. So it was nice to get out in the wilderness. And I think that reflects in the tone of the film. It's more of an adventure. We don't really have too much that happens, without giving anything away, but it shows that sense of adventure, after everything that went on, and the search continues for something like Sasquatch. Just because the world paused for a little bit, people pick up right where they left off, and that one's coming out in June. That's going to be really exciting.
You have a couple others too, just to touch on. I wonder which is your favorite or which kind of left the biggest imprint on you. Sasquatch, we already mentioned, Out of the Shadows, On the Trail of Champ, release of the Baudette film. I thought that was kind of an interesting title. I think that's about Champ too. I'm not quite sure. And then The Mystery at Loch Ness. Of those four, is there anyone in particular that you're really kind of proud or fond of and left you with some aha from working on it?
Sure. What I should say is that the release of the Baudette film was actually by a buddy of mine named Carrick St. Laurent, who has an awesome YouTube channel called Crash Course Cryptozoology. He's also a New Hampshire guy. I've been hanging out with him. I was actually just squatching with him a couple weekends ago. We did a live broadcast out in the woods of Marlborough, New Hampshire, where there's a story of the Marlborough monkey, and we were investigating a case where some folks had some potential Bigfoot activity on their property as of last summer.
Wow, that's great.
So that documentary is about the Baudette film, which supposedly shows Champ, and I got to be part of that as well and help Carrick out with some of the Champ info I had. But Mystery at Loch Ness, as much as I don't like it, it was my first really sort of short documentary about any cryptid topic, and it was about the Loch Ness Monster, which I'd always been interested in. And then Sasquatch Out of the Shadows is more, it's kind of just become a YouTube channel. It initially started out as short documentaries that I put on YouTube, and now it's turned into Bigfoot documentaries, and I do a weekly live stream every Monday night at 8 p.m. where we talk to various people in the Bigfoot field, other fields as well. I mean, people like Dr. Jeff Meldrum or Doug Hychek, producer of famous show Monster Quest, and just so many other interesting topics and guests that we have on, and kind of morphed into something else. On the Trail of Champ, as I mentioned earlier, that really started my love for the Champ subject, because I'd never really given it too much thought, which is funny because you grew up about 3 hours from Lake Champlain as I did. I was always more interested in Loch Ness, even though that was across the ocean in Scotland.
Yeah.
And then it kind of opened my eyes to Champ, and now I'm much more interested in Champ than I ever will be Loch Ness.
Is Champ as big as the Loch Ness Monster? For some reason, I always thought it was like the junior, of the two of them.
Yeah. Generally, the reports are a little bit smaller. I mean, the average is like 15 to 20 feet in length, which is not unheard of for large crocodiles or even great white sharks. 15 feet is not that big. That's the general description. It's not, 300-foot monster. Loch Ness reports tend to be a little bigger, it seems like, at least historically, even though there's a lot of doubt that's been cast on a lot of the historical Loch Ness evidence. I mean, Champ was having news stories written about it in the 1870s and 1819, 1809, the earliest kind of documented newspaper story. Before then, it was very uninhabited, but you had Native American stories, whereas Loch Ness, I mean, it really didn't have much known about it until the 1930s. So my love for Champ definitely started with On the Trail of Champ, and it's continued ever since. We went back, I go back every year, at least a couple times. I might be heading up there soon again just to take in the lake and hang out and talk to people. But going up with Chasing Legends when we went in September of 2020 was great, because we got to go back and revisit some of those places and really did an in-depth search with some local divers and went to like the deepest part of the lake, and we're scanning with side scanning sonar and had an ROV in the water, which is like a remote controlled, basically underwater drone, and did some night investigating out in kayaks in the middle of the lake at night with this amazing star, beautiful, no light pollution, just stars above you, and then the flat, calm water, and you can hear large fish jumping, and makes you wonder, what's beneath you in that 70 feet of water. So I love Lake Champlain, and I highly recommend for people who want to go visit there. I mean, you can go, depending on where you're coming from in the country, you can go and stop by Whitehall and see a lot of the Bigfoot history, and then drive right up and be in Port Henry, New York, an hour later, which has the Champ sign and a lot of Champ history, and really make a good weekend trip out of just visiting Lake Champlain.
And then go to Portland, Maine to see the Cryptozoology Museum while you're at it. Let's just wrap up. Tell us your website, and tell us kind of, you mentioned you have a show that you do, like a podcast.
Sure.
And upcoming Paracons that you're going to be at, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. The best place is petakovmedia.com. So that's PETAKOV media.com. That's got links to everything, all of my upcoming projects. It's got links to the YouTube channel. As I mentioned, that's YouTube Sasquatch Out of the Shadows. We do a weekly live stream every Monday night at 8 p.m. and I put out documentaries on there from time to time on various trips and various travels, Bigfoot related stuff. And then in terms of projects coming up, I don't know when this podcast is coming out, but on May 6th on the Small Town Monsters YouTube channel, my documentary called Beyond the Trail, the Granite State Bigfoot case is coming out, which is about my personal sort of story here in New Hampshire and investigating this case of Bigfoot sightings in this area of southwest New Hampshire. And then there's going to be other projects that will be coming out as a part of Beyond the Trail, including upcoming Maine expedition and then the Pacific Northwest and other areas as well. But in terms of events coming up, I have a few. First one is Champ Day 2021, which will be August 7th, 2021 in Port Henry, New York. And that's going to be basically on the shores of Lake Champlain. We're going to be hanging out with some other Champ and Bigfoot type researchers and just kind of hanging out. And then the other one that I have scheduled so far is the Warren Seekers of the Supernatural Paracon. And I will be a speaker and a vendor there on Saturday, October 30th, 2021 in Newtown, Connecticut, which should be fun. So those are the events I have coming up. And if you want to find out more, like I said, petakovmedia.com, I post stuff on there and you should be able to find out. So petakovmedia.com.
Your Chasing Legends series, at least year one, is on there as well too, correct?
Yeah, there's links to Chasing Legends, to Beyond the Trail, to basically if you go in the film and video section, that'll have links to basically everything that's kind of going on and past projects as well.
Do you have a Patreon page?
I don't have a Patreon, but if folks want to support any of the work I do, I have a shop on my website. You can just click on it and there's DVDs on there. There's stickers. I have some awesome Champ postcards and Granite State Bigfoot comic book, as well as you can see lines of these digital. I've got a New England Cryptid sticker and a new New Hampshire Wood Devil sticker. So that's fun.
Cool. Yeah, good stuff. I mean, because your site has a lot of great content, so people should support you. So, Alec, thank you so much. I appreciate your time today. A lot of great stuff, and I think you're the best guy we could have gotten to talk about cryptids. So I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me on, Robert.
You've been listening to the Afraid of Nothing podcast. Please subscribe and like us on Facebook. Until next time, stay scared.
Hey, you're still here? Great. Then why not listen to another episode? Visit afraidofnothingpodcast.com to peruse all the shows. That's afraidofnothingpodcast.com. And while you're there, click the coffee cup icon to buy me a coffee and leave a review. I'll give you a shout-out in an upcoming episode, and the world will know how swell you are.